Hello, my name is Dr. Ryan Anderson. I am one of the co-founders of Telos U. This webinar is designed to help you to learn about the work we'll be doing with you on parenting during your child's stay here at Telos U. Now, a lot of times, for most of our families coming in, they're very keenly aware of the changes they're wanting their child to make. And so sometimes it can be confusing that we also have a focus on the parents. It helps to understand a little bit of our understanding of parenting, and that explains why this is something that we help you focus on. So, when we think about parenting, there is a paradox associated with it. The paradox is that your parenting is not about you, it's about your child. But your parenting will require everything that you are. It will show you over and over again your strengths and your weaknesses, and it will invite you to grow like nothing ever before has invited you to grow. And again, in our research here at Telos, we find that one of the best indicators of a positive outcome for our students is that the parents are willing to dig in and do their work. And that is a powerful facilitator and influencer and motivator for the students in their growth and a good indicator of good long-term sustainable improvement. So that's why we put so much effort into helping you with your parenting. Now, as we do so, this is not intended to be a criticism for everyone. We know all of you have been trying very hard for the entirety of your child's life to guide and direct and nurture them. We also know that your child's struggles, for many of you, have become something that has kind of become this consuming force in your world, and in some ways has held you hostage. And so, as we're working on parenting, we do that with all of these things very much in mind. Now, since parenting is about children, it helps to recognize that children go through different stages. And you've experienced this. What a child is like in their first 2 years versus what they are as a young adult are two very different things because they go through developmental stages. And these developmental stages have been studied very carefully. For example, what you see here on the screen are Piaget's explorations of the different stages that children go through in the development of their cognitive abilities. Now, one thing you'll notice here is that Piaget has organized these things based on age, right? From birth to 2 years, they should be gaining things like object permanence, understanding that things still exist when they're not around. They develop their senses, they calibrate their senses. And that as that goes well, that facilitates the developments in the next stage with symbolic thinking and language used. But one of the things that we're aware of is that not every child proceeds through these with all of these developmental stages resolving well, with all of these abilities being developed. And not every child develops according to the time span that's related here. So you can imagine for someone who's born with autism, and one of the challenges of autism is that their senses don't integrate very well. That causes challenges all the way down the line. And also, as their body tries to adapt to the fact that they're having difficulty with that sensory integration, that begins to create further challenges to some of the later developmental stages. So, one of the things that we spend some time thinking about is what your child's development has looked like and where some of these stages have turned out the way they might be expected to, but where there have been deviations and what those deviations are about, because those can help us understand their struggles and the order in which we need to work on things. And of course, the way that you parent a 2-year-old is different than the way that you parent a 12-year-old. The way that you parent someone who has completed certain developmental stages is different than the way that you parent someone who has not completed those stages or who has completed them with certain complications along the way. Another way of looking at developmental stages came from Erik Erikson, who looked at psychosocial development. And you'll notice here that there's a progression. The first stage is trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame, initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority, identity versus identity confusion, intimacy versus isolation, generativity versus stagnation, and integrity versus despair. And one of the things that he recognizes, no child is all trust or all mistrust. What develops here is a balance between these two things. And sometimes that balance is healthy, and sometimes that balance causes problems. For example, trusting when you shouldn't is just as problematic as mistrusting when trust is advisable. And the inability to trust healthily gets in the way of developing personal autonomy and so on and so forth. And again, here you will see that these occur in an order, and complications in early stages can lead to further complications in later stages. And sometimes we have to go back and explore things and work on things earlier on. But again, the way that you parent someone who is just learning trust versus mistrust is different than the way that you parent someone who is working on their identity versus identity confusion. And there's different things that are appropriate and that are different levels of a good fit depending on where they are. And so, along with this, one thing we recognize is that in all development, there are certain ways in which the child will develop on their own without any help at all. But there are certain ways of developing that they will only accomplish with the right kinds of help. Vygotsky called this the zone of proximal development. And the idea is that there are certain things, as far as capacities and understanding, that they can get to unassisted. But if we want to help them work through, we create a process of scaffolding, of helping them learn step by step, providing mentorship, allowing them to try things, but not putting more of a burden on them than they're ready for. And as they go through that process, they develop greater and greater competence. And there's also an awareness that each one of us has a biological outer edge of what we can do. That no matter how much mentoring, no matter how much development that people help us with, there are certain things that just aren't going to happen. You know, my biology is such that I am never going to break a 4-minute mile. I've gotten close, but I don't think I'm ever going to get there, whereas other people can. However, I have certain capacities that I have been able to develop that are more cognitive or more social. And those have come because of the way people have helped me. But I also recognize in each one of those, I'm never going to push my IQ up to 240. That's just not something I'm possible of doing, no matter how much I work on developing my mind. And so, in the process of helping our child grow, we need to recognize that there is an area in which they need mentoring and guidance and help and support and boundaries to grow. It's important for us to have realistic expectations, to not to try to push them further than what they are capable of doing. But it's also a mistake not to be present and help them push themselves. So all of these are things that we think about when it comes to development of children. And just as there are stages of their development, there are stages of our parenting, as I've spoken to before. That, again, parenting the child on the top of the screen needs to look different than parenting the child on the bottom. And one of the big hallmarks of effective parenting is that our engagement and our scaffolding and our responsiveness is a good fit for the child's current psychosocial needs in their present stages of development. So, with that, as the child's needs evolve over time, our parenting evolves with it to continue to be that right fit of scaffolding and support. And when we fail to do that, sometimes our parenting can get stuck in the past, or sometimes our parenting is too far in the future, or sometimes we're parenting to the child we don't have, but dreamed we might have. And when those are the cases, part of what we need to do is bring our parenting back in alignment with the child who is actually in front of us. So, one thing to keep in mind all along the way when we're talking about this is don't get lost in thinking my child is 16 or 18 or 20 or 23, and by this age they should be able to do X, and therefore they must do X. It's not about age. it's about stage. And one thing that's common for many of our students is where they are in their stages is not necessarily where they would chronologically be if you pulled up one of these easy charts. These are averages. These are where a lot of people in the population are, but these are not true for everyone. And so rather than getting stuck on the idea of their chronological age, we need to get very clear about where they are developmentally and to work our efforts towards that. But there are common factors that are helpful throughout each one of these stages, no matter where your child is. And we refer to these here at Telos as the layers of effective parenting. We're going to talk about these one at a time. Now, there's a reason that these are stacked. The idea is that the parts of parenting that are further down are the foundational pieces, and that the other ones can only build upon them with the degree of stability that those underneath pieces have. So, for example, it's very hard to be consistent in our parenting if we are really struggling with our self management. And so, all along the way, recognizing if we want to be better at being effectively responsive to our child, we have to evaluate how we're doing with our self management, our healthy expectations, our collaboration and unity, and our healthy boundaries. And we may need to strengthen some of those things in order for us to grow in our effective responsiveness. So, all along the way, whenever we feel like we might be struggling with a certain layer of parenting, we're always going to want to be looking underneath to see how are we doing with that foundation that allows us to develop that particular layer. So that first layer is self-management. It's who you are emotionally and cognitively, your identity, your values, your goals, and the struggles that you face and how you deal with them. It's going to be very, very hard for you to be a stronger positive influence on your child than the strength of your ability to manage your own emotions, your own thoughts, your own behaviors, your own motivations. It's hard to parent a child into things that you've not been able to reach yourself yet either. So there are some very important things to kind of look at from the beginning. How are you at self-care? How are you at your own balance? How are you at coping with problems rather than just avoiding them? How are you at sitting with your own discomfort? How do you manage when your child is anxious? Does their anxiety become your anxiety? Do you find that you step in and take control? Do you not know how to deal with those things effectively? And does it become something that shuts you down? All of these things are really important. Do you get angry? Do you fly off the hook? Do you become impatient? Do you become pushy? Do you become disengaged? Your ability to learn to manage all of these things is really important and central to everything else you're going to try to do. And the therapists and the teams here at Telos U can help you in these areas. But it's also possible that if you're finding you have specific struggles in these areas, that we might also refer you to work with a therapist who can focus on these things with you directly to help you be effective in the other things that we're working on. So another thing that you'll find is a part of this self-management is way of being. We have a couple of other webinars that do a deep dive into this when they talk about getting out of the box. And so we're not going to go into this in great detail here, but your ability to get out of the box, stay out of the box, and let that be the way you approach your parenting with your child is extremely important. As we say in the other webinars, your way of being largely determines your influence. And so this is one of the things that we'll be helping you monitor, that we want to help you learn about, we want to help you apply, and we hope that you'll be working on applying and practicing this outside of just the relationship here, but this is something that you can work on in general. And that as you do that in any area in your life, it will improve your ability to apply that to your parenting with your child here at Telos U. And part of good parenting is knowing when we're actually struggling, when mentally we're not there, when we are in the box, or we are anxious and not dealing with it well, or we are angry and emotionally elevated and likely to be reactive, and recognizing when what we need to do is actually to take a step back, tap out, work on taking care of ourselves and getting ourselves back to a level base before we try to re engage with parenting. Otherwise, we're likely to make mistakes. This comes from our concept of the relationship continuum. We also have a training webinar about that, where you'll learn more about making sure that you are in the green so that you're in a position to invite your child into the green to make healthy and effective decisions for themselves. And again, we'll go into that in much greater detail in that webinar. The second layer is develop healthy and realistic expectations. So one of the things that's important is you need to recognize that the child you have in front of you is a unique individual, unlike anyone else. But all of us have certain expectations of the child we hoped we would have or what we were like as a child. But we need to recognize that neither one of those is the child we have. The child we have is a unique person, and we need to be thinking about them for who they are, not some abstract, arbitrary, or uninformed formulation of who they are as a person. And with that, there are things that they're capable of now. There are things they could be capable of in the future. They have things that are strengths now. They have things that are not yet strengths. They have their struggles. They have their needs. They have solutions that will work for them and solutions that won't. And some of those align with what would work for us, and some don't. So it's important to think about your child specifically, not as this statistical abstract of what they quote unquote should be. And from there, that helps us put together a realistic expectation of the speed and the order and the sequence and the process of growth and improvement looks like for them. And it's important that we develop a couple of very specific expectations that are universal. One, if we're helping your child to grow, sometimes they're going to be uncomfortable. Now, we never just create discomfort for the sake of creating discomfort. But when we're working on the things they need to work on, they will feel uncomfortable sometimes. You're going to need to expect that and to learn how to be comfortable with your child being uncomfortable in their growth process. If that's something you don't know how to tolerate, it's not something they're going to tolerate, and that's going to impede their growth. Another important thing to expect is that their growth will happen by degrees, but only as we make room for it. That doesn't mean we just open the field wide and say, okay, go out there and you can do all the things. We need to be thoughtful and use that scaffolding, have them tackle one step at a time. We do need to open up space strategically, thoughtfully, wisely for them to do things that are a little bit beyond their current capacity. And that can be anxiety provoking. But we also need to be intelligent not to open up so much space that they don't have enough support and they're not likely to be successful. There's a progressive aspect to it. It's also important to recognize that they didn't come here to Telos to succeed, 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 and never have any struggles. They're here to deal with the things that challenge them and that have provoked failures of different types. And so their growth is not going to be linear. It's not going to be without setbacks. It's going to be up and down, and the general process will be forward. But if we're expecting it to be completely smooth and clean and non-messy in the middle, that's not a realistic expectation. And it will lead to us bailing out on things that would work because we don't have a realistic expectation of what the change process looks like. The third layer is collaboration and unity. One thing we need to recognize is that you are not the only influence in your child's life. And the ability to which that you can build a community, a collaborative, helpful community with your child, that will accelerate your ability to be an effective parent. And one thing that we need to be aware of is that the child is unlikely to become healthier than the interactions between those involved in guiding and nurturing them. So, for example, if you have two parents who are always on different pages and combating with each other, that undermines parenting. Or if we have parents battling the treatment team here at Telos, that undermines parenting and treatment. And so while we recognize there are differences, we need to find a way to help that interaction be healthy enough to provide a firm base for the child. And of course, that can be challenging when there's been divorce or significant differences in parenting philosophies or deep hurt feelings between people. So, one of the things we need to recognize is that those differences become rich ground for the child to divide and conquer. They learn that the easier way for them to manage their anxieties is to poke on a difference between the parents or the parents and the team and to turn them against each other. Not only does that not help the child grow, but it teaches a very maladaptive, manipulative way of solving problems by downloading them onto other people. So we need to be very careful not to fall into that trap. Where you know that you and the other parent have different ways of thinking about things and the child approaches you or them, what we need to do is defer all decisions where there are likely to be differences between the way you feel until you have worked out some kind of an agreement with the co parent. What we don't want to do is have the child scoring goals with one parent or the other or both and making them compete with each other for who is more aligned with the child and who the child is more likely to turn to with these things. Because if things become a question of which parent is going to win in the competitive game of parenting and getting child alignment, then we can be pretty certain that everybody is going to lose, but especially the child. The fourth layer is having healthy boundaries. And it's important to recognize that when we don't have boundaries, it's like not having a map or having a compass. It's like not knowing how to navigate the world around them. And in the absence of boundaries, our young adults are often led by their impulses, their desire for ease, their fear of effort and failure. And so we need boundaries to help show them the way towards success and the way towards growth and how to be healthy. That's the purpose of boundaries. And a boundary is saying, look, these are the expectations. They're not going to be overly rigid. They're going to be general principles and ideas and practices that still allow a lot of flexibility in how they are applied. And boundaries also include saying, look, if you cross some of these boundaries, you will now know ahead of time what kinds of responses that you can expect from us so that it's not mysterious to you that, for example, if you're really struggling to manage your technology, that we're going to dial it back. Or if you decide that you are going to try to engage in drug use, which is something self destructive and we can't support, you know that we're going to respond in this way. And our boundaries are not threats, they're not coercive, but they are a clear response of what we're going to do if we find ourselves in those kinds of situations. Now, good boundaries over time can help build up trust, but sometimes students push back and say, oh, you have boundaries, it means you don't trust me. No, trust is a product of consistency over time in the face of adversity. Trust isn't about valuing or loving, it's about recognizing what they're ready for. But boundaries aren't just about trust, they're about capacity. And so avoid the trap of letting yourself get sucked into defining boundaries as a matter of trust. What are some hallmarks of good boundaries? Well, they acknowledges the challenges that the other people are going to have, and they put some structure and some support and some guidelines in place to help them navigate those challenges. They acknowledge the strengths that the other person has, and they allow them room to use those strengths. They are designed to assist in growth, not to coerce or to punish. They should expand over time as growth is demonstrated. And the general principle that we like to follow here is that they can have what they can handle. And as they show that they're handling what they have, that's when we're willing to explore putting more things on the table for them. So having good boundaries removes ambiguity. It helps and comforts because they know what you actually believe, where you actually stand, what you're willing to do to support them, the thinking behind the guidance that you give, but also what they can expect as far as your response if they're struggling. Good boundaries are things that you have thought through. They're not emotionally driven. They're not reactive. They're not punitive. They are a thoughtful response to your child's choices based on your understanding of the underlying drivers of those choices. Your boundaries should always be aligned with what's in the best interest of your child. You should never allow yourself to expound your boundaries into something that's going to harm your child. And good boundaries are based on principles and values. They're never just a because I said so kind of thing. There's a reason, there's a purpose, and there's a direction behind each boundary. Keep in mind that if we are not able to set and hold good boundaries, then everything we're trying to do with your child will be like a crumbling foundation. And people without boundaries tend to seek the easiest path. They tend to flow downhill like water. And like water, they tend to erode and destroy things that they run through. The fifth layer is learning to be effectively responsive. Let's talk a little bit about what this word responsive means. So, the first is comparing being responsive to being reactive. Reactive is having your emotions activated and then acting from those emotions. I'm angry, I'm anxious, I'm distressed, and I let that drive me. Whereas being responsive is I'm seeing what's going on with my child. I'm seeing the struggles they're going through and what they need in the moment. And I calibrate my response to that. Now, something else that is not the same as being responsive is being avoidant or permissive. This idea that if we're simply just letting the child do whatever, that's not even really parenting. That's not giving guidance. That's not helping them grow. That's allowing entropy to be their parent and allowing downhill to be the only destination they're likely to get to. Responsiveness doesn't mean disengaged, so busy with all of your own concerns and worries that you're at a distance from your child. And it also does not mean enabling. There's a difference between assisting someone to grow and doing things for them. And a lot of times, enabling feels like being a really, really responsive parent. But what it is actually inadvertently being a very, very crippling parent. And so recognizing that we can help our children, but we need to calibrate that help in a way that requires them to do what they are capable of and also is helping them stretch a little bit beyond following that scaffolding principle. So if we're doing a good job of being responsive, we're going to spend a lot of time, in fact, 80% of our time and energy, not just waiting for something to go wrong and dealing with it, but helping things go right. What you see here on the screen is the pyramid of influence or the peacemaking pyramid. We have another webinar on that, so we're not going to go into it in great detail here. But the idea is that if we spend most of our time helping things go right, then most of the time things will go right. And also, that time and effort and foundation that we've built helping things go right really allows us to be much more effective in responding when something goes wrong. So, as you learn this and other Telos tools and strategies, the more likely you are to be able to be effective at responding and being responsive rather than being reactive in some way to your child as they grow and as they go through the mistakes and the successes that are going to be a part of the process here. Layer 6 is consistency. Now, it's important, going back to realistic expectations, for both yourself and for your child. Neither one of you is going to be perfect. That is beyond your capacity and beyond their capacity. So, part of consistency is knowing that when you have made a mistake, you respond by owning your mistake and being open with your child about it and having very specific things that you're doing to correct that mistake. We do not pretend that we're flawless. We do not pretend that we are incapable of making wrong decisions. In fact, one of the most important things that we can model for your child is the appropriate way to bounce back from having made a mistake. And it's important as you go along to not take vacations from healthy expectations. Sometimes things are going really well. And so we're like, this is great. I no longer have to do some of these things that we've been doing. Well, the reason it's going great is because you're doing the things that you're doing. And if you cease to do what helps things go right, then things have a tendency to cease going right. And so it's one of those recognizing we're developing new patterns and we want to help those new patterns continue. With that, it's important to recognize that old patterns that weren't working do kind of have a gravity well effect, that if we drift too close to them, we can find ourselves being sucked right in unless we're being completely aware and having our eyes open and making sure that we're putting energy into helping create the new patterns proactively. We all have things that are going to challenge our consistency. It may be our energy level, it may be the number of other things that need attention in our lives. It's important that you know what yours are and that you actually have a strategy to deal with them. And that's a strategy that you actively have in play. It's not some in case of emergency plan that you keep on a shelf somewhere. It's an active day to day, this is what I am doing to keep myself engaged in helping things go right and in creating these positive and helpful patterns. Then the last layer is confidence. It's important that you don't panic at the first signs of regression into old patterns, that when you struggle or they struggle, that you don't go and throw your hands up and say, I guess we never accomplished anything, we're way back to square one. That is never the truth. There are going to be hard times, but what you need to work on cultivating inside yourself, and the way you will get there is through your consistency and seeing how this works and experiencing and feeling it for yourself. You will develop trust that hard times and regression will pass if you are persistent with your efforts in solidifying these new patterns that you're working on. So you have to take the long view, a longer perspective. Now, sometimes your child is going to be unhappy with what you're doing, with the boundaries that you have in place, with the expectations that you're putting, with the way you're trying to help them grow. Your job is not to make your child happy all the time. Your job is to help your child grow. They are human beings, and sometimes human beings are upset about having to do healthy things. Think about how many people kind of hate having to exercise, but it's an important thing for us to do. Think how embarrassing it is to have to apologize, but it's a healthy and important thing to do. Sometimes we have adverse effects to something that's going to do good for us. Be okay with that. Learn to be okay with that sometimes being your child's reaction to you, and have faith that as you remain consistent, that they're going to continue to grow and they're going to continue to mature and they're going to get to a point where they're going to have the ability to change their perspective on these healthy things and not forever be angry or upset that they need to do things that have been hard for them. And so it's important that with that we don't just give up and say, it's easier just to not try this and to give up on tomorrow's growth for today's ease. Well, it's time to get to work. What can you do? First, start by taking the layers of effective parenting evaluation. This can be a little hard to be completely honest with yourself about, but do yourself the favor. Be straightforward. Examine it as honestly as you can. And where you feel you can, work on getting some feedback from other people who observe your parenting and can let you know what they can see. Then use it with your therapist to evaluate both your strengths and your challenges. Set targets for growth and improvement, things you can work on a daily basis. And make sure to strengthen those lower layers so that you can be able to be more effective in the higher layers. We are so grateful for your willingness to work with us and to recognize that as you work on building your skills, your ability, your responsiveness as a parent, you allow us to be the most effective we can be in fulfilling the mission you've given us of helping your child grow into young adulthood.